The NYPD works with multiple law enforcement agencies from federal, state, to local, as you've probably seen examples of throughout the video. At the federal level, the NYPD will work with federal law enforcement agencies like the FBI, or Federal Bureau of Investigation, the DEA, or Drug Enforcement Administration, the ATF, or Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the USMS, or U.S. Marshal Service, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, the U.S. Secret Service, or USSS, the NCIS, or Naval Criminal Investigative Service, and multiple others. So, for example, upon the aftermath of the 9/11, the NYPD worked in strong coordination with the FBI in investigating the attacks and finding the perpetrators responsible for the attacks. This was actually, they were actually the first two members of the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force. The FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force was actually started upon 9/11 in investigating the attacks, but it actually expanded over the years to basically a all active task force, or a constantly active task force working to combat terrorism. So it was originally just meant for investigating the 9/11 attacks, but nowadays it just it's constant. It's a constant task force, constantly working. Its goal is to basically combat terroristic threats through interagency collaboration between local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies. There are many members, but what's unique about the NYPD is that it was the first member, one of the first members, along with the FBI, which leads it, of course. But then at the state level, they'll work with agencies like the New York State Police, New York State Courts Police, and multiple others. In protecting in protecting New York citizens. But then at the local level, this is probably the level they work with the most frequently, or the agencies they work with the most frequently. These agencies would include let's see, the New York City Sheriff's Office, the New York City Department of Correction, the New York City Department of Environmental Protection Police, the New York City Parks, the New York City Parks Law Enforcement. I forgot its full name, or its proper name, but it's basically the New York City Parks Police, and multiple other New York City law enforcement agencies. The New York City actually has some of the most municipal law enforcement agencies out of all municipalities in the U.S. They have an unbelievably large amount of municipal law enforcement agencies. That's really it for their coordination and collaboration. Does the NYPD have jurisdiction on New York City subways? This is a very common question, and the answer to it is essentially yes. The NYPD does have jurisdiction over New York City subways. In fact, they have an entire bureau for it, for protecting it. And while New York City subways are owned by the New York City Transportation Authority, or New York City Transit Authority, which is owned by the MTA, which is a state agency, the NYPD still has jurisdiction over it because there are clear cooperative agreements between the MTA and the NYPD when it comes to policing New York City subways, and just MTA property in general in New York City. And essentially the reason for that is because Um, the New York City subways, they are a very, very populated place and location for transit. In fact, they are one of the most populated transit locations in the U.S. If the MTA police, which is the primary agency for patrolling MTA property like New York City subways, they only got like 200 officers or so, maybe a bit more, but that they have a very small amount. Um, there simply aren't enough MTA police officers to patrol each and every single one of the New York City subways. I mean, there are so many people who use New York City subways each day, and there are so many crimes that take place in it each day. The MTA police just can't handle it by itself. So because of that, the NYPD does have jurisdiction over it. Um, yeah, so basically, that's if you've ever watched Law and Order, you've probably seen the homicide detectives in it investigating crimes in New York City subways at one point. And essentially, in real life, the only reason why they're allowed to do that or have jurisdiction to investigate crimes in New York City subways is because of those cooperative agreements or collaborative agreements between the MTA and the NYPD. Without those cooperative agreements, the NYPD would not legally have jurisdiction over New York City subways, as they are state property. But in this case, New York City subways are very free or free willing to who polices it. So yeah. For the question, does the NYPD have jurisdiction over the John F. Kennedy International Airport? The answer is no. The NYPD does not have jurisdiction over the John F. Kennedy International Airport, unlike they do over MTA property in New York City, like New York City subways. Um, uh, while the city of New York does while the city of New York does own the John F. Kennedy International Airport, it is operated and managed by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, and therefore is considered by state property, which is not within the NYPD's jurisdiction. By state property, for those who don't know, is essentially property owned by essentially property owned by two states, both basically both the and in this case it would be both the state of New Jersey and the state of New York. So therefore, the only agencies with jurisdiction over it would be the New York State Police and the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey Police Department. Now, the New Jersey State Police, while it is also owned by the state of New Jersey, the New Jersey State Police does not have peace officer authority in the state of New York. And therefore is not allowed to police it, even though it's outside, even though it's owned by the state of New Jersey too. It's the same idea it's the same idea as how the MBTA Transit Police does not have jurisdiction over MBTA property in Rhode Island. That's because they're not sworn peace officers in Rhode Island. They're sworn peace officers in Massachusetts. Yeah, so essentially that's the answer. And in fact, this is not only for the John F. Kennedy International Airport, but in fact all airports in New York City, because all airports in New York City, all public airports, are owned by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. So that's it for the NYPD. They don't have jurisdiction over any airport. So that's why you don't see the NYPD at airports very often in New York City. While they may have a memorandum of understanding for the NYPD responding in a very large emergency, there are no current mutual aid agreements between the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey Police Department, which is the primary agency for patrolling Port Authority of New York and New Jersey property, like JFK International Airport. There are no current mutual aid agreements between the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey Police Department and the NYPD, and therefore the NYPD just does not have jurisdiction over it. Even with mutual aid agreements, as you know, as set clear by many courts in the past, mutual aid agreements do not dismiss an officer's or do not do not dismiss an officer's jurisdiction. So it's like how I was talking about earlier, how when campus police, even if they have mutual aid agreements, even if they have mutual aid agreements with local police departments, they still cannot operate within those localities because they don't have jurisdiction there. It's only in real emergencies. That's really it for that question. Yeah. For the question, what's the difference between the NYPD and the New York City Sheriff's Office, or NYSO for short? Before I get into the answer, I do want to cover the similarities between the two agencies, because this if you've ever wondered this question, it's a good question because the agencies are very similar. Both are municipal law enforcement agencies operating under the executive branch of the New York City government. Both have, and of course, yes, multiple, usually law enforcement agencies operate under the executive branch, but there are certain law enforcement agencies that don't operate under the executive branch. So, for example, the U.S. Capitol Police, they operate under the legislative branch of the federal government, and obviously completely separate because that's at the federal level. But still, there are municipal law enforcement agencies that operate under the legislative branch and other branches than the executive branch. So that's one similarity. Both have citywide jurisdiction throughout the city of New York. Both report overall, both overall report to the mayor of New York City. While it's not always directly, both do overall report to the mayor of New York City, obviously because they fall under the executive branch of the New York City government. But anyways, but the main difference when it comes to their differences is that, population or employee count wise, one of their main differences is that the NYPD is significantly larger. They have like over 30,000 officers and multiple other civilian employees. They are significantly larger. Significantly larger than the NYSO. The NYSO only has like a few hundred officers. Their employee count is significantly different. But the main difference that I should highlight here is their responsibility. The NYPD, on one hand, they are the primary law enforcement agency for the city of New York, while the NYSO is not. The NYPD has very much broader focus. They focus on protecting and policing the entire city of New York. And while the NYSO does focus on law enforcement throughout the city of New York as a citywide law enforcement agency, they explicitly focus on civil enforcement. So essentially, carrying out court orders. That's what they do a lot. For example, if someone fails to show up to court, they are most likely the ones to pursue that person. Tax evasion too, evading local taxes. They would also most likely investigate into that. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff. But I mean, yeah, of course, the NYPD has a much broader responsibility and much more duties. So again, so in simpler words, the NYPD, they focus on protecting policing. New York City in general, they are the de facto municipal police department for the city of New York, while the NYSO is just one of the many municipal law enforcement agencies within the city of New York, and essentially just it's basically responsible for carrying out court orders and civil enforcement duties. And but one important thing to note is the difference between again, kind of getting a bit off topic here from the question, but one important thing to note is the difference, because you might be wondering what's the difference between the New York City Sheriff's Office and the New York State Courts Police when it comes to court related matters, because both basically, I can't say this without revealing their difference. So essentially, basically the difference between the New York City Sheriff's Office and the New York State Courts Police is that the New York City Sheriff's Office, they focus on carrying out court orders, while the New York State Courts Police primarily focuses on protecting the court itself. So, in other words, the New York State Courts Police, they are there to protect the actual courts. The New York City Sheriff's Office is more of the enforcement arm of the court, or in other words, they are the one responsible for carrying out court orders. So while both do have the ability to carry out court orders, the New York City Sheriff's Office is generally the one who carries out the court orders, and the New York State Courts Police is generally the one protecting the courts. In fact, speaking of which, if you've ever watched Law and Order, one interesting thing is that during their trials, that actually takes place in the New York City Supreme Court, I believe. Yeah, so that's why, because the New York City Supreme Court is a state court, that is why you see, the officers in the backgrounds standing, the court officers, standing during in the courthouse when court is in session. That's why you'll see them wearing the vest New York State Courts, because that they are a New York State court officer, and they are protecting the court. They are carrying out their responsibility. So you would most likely see the New York City Sheriff's Office carrying out court orders, or carrying out a warrant for upon a court order, rather than them protecting it, than them actually protecting the court itself. So yeah. But then, yeah, when it comes back on topic, when it comes to the difference between the NYPD and the New York City Sheriff's Office, it's just their main responsibilities. You're more likely to see the NYPD running radar at a school zone than you are to see a New York City Sheriff's deputy doing that. And actually, one more important thing to note is that, while a bit off topic, the New York City Sheriff's Office, despite being led by a sheriff, a de facto sheriff, the person that's led by, the sheriff, is not the chief law enforcement officer in New York City. And the reason why I'm saying that is because the sheriff is generally the chief law enforcement officer, but that's when it comes to county sheriffs. This is a municipal sheriff, which is very unique and rare. Municipal sheriffs, they're very unique, and they're just another municipal law enforcement agency. They're not a real sheriff's office. While they are called sheriffs, they act as just another municipal law enforcement agency. You might as well call it court enforcement officers or whatever. They're not an actual sheriff's office, if that makes sense. Because again, it's like the same idea as the Hawaii State Sheriff. They're the de facto state police agency for Hawaii. They are not an actual sheriff's office. Otherwise, they would be led by a sheriff who would have control over the entire state of New York, which would Hawaii, which would be impossible. So, in other words, the only sheriff with control over the only sheriff who serves as the chief law enforcement officer is a county sheriff. So, sorry about that. I know that was confusing, but what was I going to cover? Yeah, no, that's pretty much it. That's pretty much it. For that. Yeah. Oh, and then additionally, I know I'm sorry I'm taking up a lot of time here, but another difference is that the New York City Sheriff's Office is led by a sheriff who is a sworn peace officer in the state of New York, or in other words, an actual law enforcement officer. The NYPD, on the other hand, is led by a commissioner who is a civilian-held position, or in other words, is not a law enforcement officer, but a civilian. So that is a very important distinction.